So today I'm going to be talking about how depression can lead to substance abuse, impulsive behavior, and suicidal behavior, as well as completed suicide. Most people know somebody that has depression. It's actually really common, and in a study made by MedicineNet, it is said that about 20% of people will develop depression before they enter adulthood. I've done research on this topic, I've done papers on it, and we're going to be talking about how it can lead to teenage suicide. First of all, we need to understand what depression means and what it is. So depression is categorized as a mental illness that changes the way people think, act, and feel. The symptoms include, but are not limited to, lack of appetite, oversleeping, overeating, loss of pleasure in doing things one usually enjoys, sleeping too much, feeling sad, depressed, feeling hopeless, and feeling lonely. So now that we know what depression is, we're going to be talking about how it leads to suicidal behaviors. Depression can occur at any age, but is particularly common in young adults. Loneliness has definitely spiked in the last couple of years. More people are communicating electronically, and electronically communicating can equal to cyberbullying, and cyberbullying is a sure way to develop depression. It is a fact that cyberbullying can lead teenagers to feel depressed. Also, childhood trauma, inheriting it genetically, can also cause people to feel depressed. Depression can run in people's families. Feeling helpless, hopeless, and developing negative thinking patterns is also a way that people will develop depression. Now that we have a basic understanding of what depression is, let's talk about how it contributes to teenage suicide in today's society. So teenagers who suffer from depression are much more likely to commit suicide, and they're actually considered really high risk for potential suicides. 95% of people who die by suicide are dealing with a mental health issue at the time. Suicide is the third leading cause of death in people ages 15 to 24. Males are 4 times more likely to commit suicide, and around 60% of suicides are containing firearms, but females are more likely to consider suicide without going through with it, and females are more likely to overdose or cut. There are at least 25 attempts for every completed suicide. Depression can lead to impulsive and dangerous behaviors also, such as substance abuse and self-harm, and 17% of people attempt suicide every single year. According to the American Psychiatric Association, 20% of people will develop depression before they enter adulthood. Feeling hopeless, developing negative thinking patterns contributes to depression, as well as the fact that loneliness has spiked over the last couple of years and people are feeling more and more lonely, especially teenagers. So now that we have a basic understanding of what depression is, we're going to talk about how it leads to suicidal thoughts and behaviors. There are 17% of people attempt suicide every year. Males are 4 times more likely to try to commit suicide, but females are more likely to think about suicide. It's just not always completed. 60% of suicides contain the use of firearms, and it's usually done by males, as females are more likely to consider cutting or overdosing. Suicide is the third leading cause of death for ages 15 to 24. There are around 25 attempted suicides for every completed suicide. Threats of suicide are considered to be cries for help, and they should be addressed immediately and taken very seriously. A lot of people are really afraid to come forward when they're feeling depressed because they don't want to be judged and they don't want to have the stigma put around them, but it's really important to take these kind of things seriously because you never know when somebody could be feeling depressed and contemplating suicide. Depression also leads to risky behaviors such as substance abuse. It can cause people to self-harm, which is no good. Self-harm and suicide has been on the rise in the past 2 decades. Around 95% of the people that die by suicide are experiencing some kind of psychological trauma at the time. Childhood trauma can also lead to depression, and that can increase the risk of suicidal behaviors. As I stated earlier, 20% of people are affected by mental illness every single year, and it's very common for it to happen right as people are going into adulthood, and 17% of people will attempt suicide each year, which is a really big number considering the population, and it's really sad, and it should be taken very seriously and addressed immediately. So that does conclude my research on teenage depression and suicide and how it leads to suicidal behaviors. So to sum up, depression is a really serious mental illness that a lot of kids struggle with today. Depression can also lead to impulsive behaviors such as self-harm, suicidal thoughts, and suicidal actions, as well as substance abuse. And teenagers who have depression are much more likely to consider attempting suicide. And like I said, 17% of people consider suicide each year. So depression and mental illness is something that should be taken very, very seriously, especially when it comes to children, and it should be addressed immediately, and that could save somebody's life. Thank you for listening to my speech on depression and how it has impacted the teenage suicide rate. So hopefully people will take mental health a little bit more seriously and stop stigmatizing it, because you never know when somebody is going to need help.